Thank you. You know, have had the privilege of going last on each of these panels, which makes my job much easier because the previous speakers, Jake, and I'm very happy to meet you finally, having read about your struggle from afar, and we've even published a few things about it on the Electronic Intifada. And Paul, for laying out so clearly the logic of BDS. And so what I want to say will kind of touch on some of the issues that we've had in both presentations so far. The basic condition for the maintenance of Israeli occupation, apartheid, and settler colonialism is that Israel has to maintain tremendous power over the Palestinians. There has to be a massive power imbalance. And the reason Israel says it loves dialogue and endless negotiations is because they do not threaten the power balance. The logic of BDS is to change the balance of power, to make it not cost-free for Israel and its allies and the beneficiaries of Israel's crimes to continue to enjoy them without paying a cost. So BDS calls for action, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, whose goal is to impose a price on those who are complicit in Israel's oppression of the Palestinians. So unlike empty, endless dialogue, BDS is very threatening to the status quo, a status quo that Israel wants to preserve. This is why we see that the same sort of power that is being used to oppress Palestinians every day, this accumulated power, is now being used to try to suppress the BDS movement precisely because it offers a path to change the balance of power. And because BDS is made up of nonviolent civil society activities, not government activities, and not violence, although, of course, Palestinians have a right to armed struggle and resistance, but the particular BDS strategy deals with civil action. It's been quite difficult for Israel to find ways to suppress it. When you actually explain BDS to people, you explain its goals, which are to advance human rights. It's very, very difficult to argue against that. So there have to be all sorts of strategies to try to undermine BDS, which include smearing people, and certainly we've heard about that from Professor Lynch regarding the smear of anti-Semitism, which has been used so many times that could take up a whole day's symposium easily. But another strategy we've talked about today is attempting to sell Israel positively. Very difficult to do because it's very hard to get people to focus on cherry tomatoes and high tech when they can see what Israel is doing to Palestinians every day. So a strategy that is being pursued with great vigor is to try to silence people, silencing and censorship, particularly of the BDS movement. Now, what's incredible is how not new this is. It always seems new, but I was in Amman a few months ago, and there was an exhibition at Darat al-Funun, which is a wonderful arts center in Amman, of work by the Palestinian artist Emily Jasser, and it included on the wall blown up clippings from the New York Times from the 1960s, from the World's Exposition. I can't remember exactly when it was in the mid-60s, in New York, where there was the Jordanian pavilion, which had a display about the West Bank and the refugees in 1948, and the incredible bullying effort by pro-Israel groups to shut it down and to demand the boycotts of the Jordanian pavilion, and to, you know, get local politicians to denounce it, and so on and so forth. And, you know, it's really could be happening today. So it's important to maintain the historical memory of how this kind of thuggery and censorship has really been there from the very start. But we see the censorship efforts really taking an alarming turn in that they attack the very basic rights which are supposed to define a free society and a democracy. And we see a global epidemic of censorship or a free speech emergency when it comes to the question of Palestine. We've seen what's happening at Sydney University. I was, by the way, very impressed by that article in the Australian, about my visa issue, and I will be interested to know if the university ever answers the question. Without going into great detail, I can say that the kind of corporatization of universities is so closely related to this censorship, because as universities become businesses, they think and behave like businesses, where image and brand is everything. Controversy is bad for business. Ideas that challenge the status quo are bad for business. You want fee-paying middle-class families to feel safe sending their children to your university, and ugly controversies are not good for business. And so we see this managerial thinking really infecting every element of how universities react to this. And this was certainly true with the way the University of Illinois handled Stephen Salaita. And when we started to delve into the emails through Freedom of Information requests, we saw that these people were thinking only like fundraisers and business people, and had no regard whatsoever for the basic things that, of course, the university claims to support, like academic freedom and intellectual independence and so on. It just was not at all a factor in their internal discussions. It wasn't there at all. It was about pleasing the powers that be, pleasing the donors, and so on. And that's true in the UK, or I suspect it's true in the UK, where the University of Southampton has, for the second year in a row, banned a conference on Israel and international law that is being addressed, or was supposed to be addressed by Israeli professors and others, on the grounds of health and safety. So this real abuse of health and safety laws is a form of censorship. And in the United States, we see a systematic attack on the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement from politicians, political leaders, and legislators. Hillary Clinton gave the most revolting speech you can imagine to AIPAC, the Israel lobby group, a week or so ago, in which she said that the BDS movement is, you know, anti-Semitic, and that she, as president, would fight it to the hilt. But she's not alone, of course. We've seen state legislatures, the first one being Illinois, where I live, actually legislating to try to, they can't outlaw BDS, and I'll say more about why they can't do that in a minute, but to try to smear it. You know, you get headlines in the paper saying, Illinois passes anti-BDS law, or well, what they're actually doing is passing laws. In Illinois, they passed a law that says that, it's so ironic, because the state pension fund is now barred by law from investing in, I learned that you call that a super in Australia. All right, so the Illinois super, I'm going to use that term. A term that nobody would understand in the United States. So the Illinois State Pension Fund is barred by law from investing in companies. It must divest from companies that have divested from Israel or taken other boycott-related actions. So Illinois, because the law was passed last year, the Illinois Pension Board just last week published a blacklist of 11 companies from which it must divest, including G4S. So, you know, the irony is that in order to protest divestment from G4S, the state of Illinois must divest from or is barred from investing in G4S. The serious point here, though, is that, you know, the Human Rights Watch, not a radical organization by any means, particularly when it comes to Palestine, but to give them credit, they published a landmark report in January that said that companies cannot fulfill their human rights obligations if they have any business whatsoever with the settlements. In other words, what they're saying is there's no ethical way to do business in Israeli settlements. The only way to be ethical and to comply with human rights standards is to end all business with Israeli settlements. And that was really a new position for Human Rights Watch. They published a fantastic report that really details the way any business with settlements contributes to serious violations of Palestinian rights. So really what Illinois and now 6 other states are saying is that they are going to punish companies that respect human rights, that you must be willing to violate human rights in order to draw investment from the Illinois Pension Fund, which is bankrupt anyway. Illinois is one of the most financially insolvent states in the United States, but that's another issue. New York is considering a law which goes even further. It requires the state to keep a blacklist of individuals and companies that are engaged in boycott, BDS-related activity. This, I think, is, you know, unprecedented since the McCarthy era, where the state is going to just put your name on a list because you might have written an op-ed or you might have been involved in a campaign that where you support BDS. And the language in the law is very broad. So there's really nothing to say that just writing an article in a newspaper might not get you on this official state blacklist with which the state is barred from doing business. This law, I think, is still in process, but the important point is that if such a law passes, and there were clauses within the Illinois law that did not make it into law because civil rights organizations said, we will challenge them. You know, if that law passes in New York, it's very clear that there will be a constitutional challenge. There's a very important, you know, in the United States, we have a Bill of Rights. I was surprised to learn that Australia has no Bill of Rights, and basic rights, basic individual rights are not defined clearly in the Australian Constitution or Australian law. But the United States has a Bill of Rights, and one of the most important elements, or the most cherished elements, is the First Amendment, the right to free speech. And this is often misunderstood. The right to free speech is the right to free speech free from government intervention. The First Amendment prevents the government or other public bodies, so including public universities, from restricting your right to free speech. And boycott is a constitutionally protected right in the United States. This goes back to a case that began in 1966 in the town of Port Gibson, Mississippi, where the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, called for a boycott of white-owned businesses in Port Gibson, Mississippi, because of the town's racist policies and these businesses' racist policies. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. It took until 1982, but in 1982, the US Supreme Court decided that, well, the case was that the businesses sued the NAACP. They said, we're losing business because you called for a boycott. You owe us damages. In 1982, in this case, NAACP versus Claiborne, the Supreme Court ruled that boycott, that a boycott called in order to effect social, political, or economic change is a form of free speech that deserves the highest protection of the First Amendment. And of course, we know that boycotts are celebrated in US history. The Montgomery bus boycott, everyone has heard the story of Rosa Parks. So the attack on the BDS movement is an attack on the most fundamental rights to free speech. And if this is happening in the US, which has these constitutional protections, then we see this going even further in countries like the UK and France. In France, which I've written a lot about at the Electronic Intifada, people are now being arrested for wearing T-shirts that say boycott apartheid Israel, or for holding protests at supermarkets saying don't buy Israeli goods, as people did during the struggle against apartheid South Africa. And in the UK, we see the government trying to intimidate democratically elected local councils by threatening them with financial sanctions and lawsuits if they vote democratically not to do business with companies profiting from Israeli human rights abuses. And we see Israel and its lobbying organizations leading this attack on free speech in a number of ways, including lobbying at universities, as is happening at the University of California, to get them to adopt official definitions that basically make criticism of Israel or anti-Zionism a form of anti-Semitism, basically hate speech, which would then be subject to disciplinary proceedings, and certainly would be speech that is ostracized. And that effort is ongoing now at the University of California and other campuses. But we also see the Israeli state leading direct efforts to sabotage and attack the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, including through covert action. And this is not, you know, a sort of a speculative thing. During Israeli Apartheid Week, we saw, for example, massive denial of service attacks against a number of BDS-related websites, and just a few weeks before, Israel had announced a cyber war against the BDS movement. And most disturbingly, just a few days ago in Jerusalem, Israel held an the Israeli newspaper, Yediot Ahronot, held an anti-BDS conference which was addressed by all the great and the good in Israel. And the Israeli minister, Israel Katz, called for what he called targeted civil eliminations of BDS activists. This is chilling language that resembles what Israel calls targeted killings. So it's not clear if he actually meant killing BDS activists, but that can't be ruled out in terms of the language he used. But what the Israeli Interior Minister, Aryeh Deri, said was that Israel may revoke the residency of Omar Barghouti, one of the co-founders of the BDS movement. So we're seeing Israel begin to openly move in, to treating people calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions as quote-unquote terrorists through using brute force and coercion and other forms of subterfuge and sabotage. The good news, and I'll end on this note, is that the BDS movement is more than 10 years old. Paul mentioned some of the victories with Veolia and G4S, and I could list many, many more, far more than we have time to cover. And the attacks have not slowed the momentum. And I don't think they will. But we do have to be very aware that these attacks are going to increase, and as people get more into BDS activism in Australia, you're going to have to prepare for more of what's happening at Sydney University. You will see your government, this is something you can take to the bank or deposit in your super, that your government will behave no differently from the UK government, from France, and from the state legislators in Illinois. You have the benefit of foresight, so you can prepare to fight back. Thank you.